All right. Like I said, my name is Rebekah Coffman, and I am here leading the Tangible Intangible project for the Religion, Art, and Technology Lab. And we're joined today by a great set of contributors who are going to discuss their topics. So with that, I'm going to start off with, it's in alphabetical order, not my preference. So just to put that out there. So the first contributor is Sher Afgan Tareen.
Thank you, Rebekah, for inviting me to contribute for the Tangible Intangible. My project looks at how a very tangible act of consuming a soup called the white bean soup, which is a staple dish of the Nation of Islam, how it allowed for a very intangible feeling of being connected to your ancestors, having memories of your ancestors, who had been forcibly enslaved in the Americas, and as a consequence, forgot that they were Muslim because of the food which was served to them on the slave plantations. So I was really interested in trying to figure out, in other words, the relationship between food and memory. Traditionally speaking, we think that consciousness exists in the mind, but this project tries to hammer out the point that perhaps consciousness is in fact in our intestines and our stomach. And it looks at the history of the Nation of Islam through the prism of the story where Clara Muhammad, the wife of Elijah Muhammad, meets a man by the name of Fard Muhammad, who had migrated to the streets of Detroit, Michigan, missionizing Islam, having left back then the British subcontinent and from the city of Lahore. And this encounter between the two leads to Fard teaching Clara how to make this soup. And this soup would then become the staple dish of an entire religious movement called the Nation of Islam. So I trace the movement from this prism of this encounter, which is different than how most historians of religion tend to study Nation of Islam. They tend to focus on the male leaders, particularly Elijah and then Malcolm X, and they tend to privilege the doctrinal ideas espoused by the Nation of Islam as opposed to look at the day-to-day life and predicaments like starvation, living in a segregated neighborhood of Detroit called the Hastings Street neighborhood, right in the immediate aftermath of the Great Depression, when the men don't have opportunities to work and make a living, and this neighborhood is on its way to becoming razed and with a highway constructed over it. So lots going on, and I wanted to focus on this story. And in the midst of it, I learned a lot of interesting things that I don't want to talk about right now, but things about the history of the Food and Drug Administration, history of how chemistry, the scientific field of chemistry, became intertwined with cooking, history of the guy Kellogg, whose cereals we are so accustomed to, his wife, Ella Eaton Kellogg, who's also in Michigan area, and how she might have impacted Clara, etc. So anyways, looking forward to my fellow contributors.
Thank you, Sher. All right, next, do you want to advance? Amanda, thank you. So for this part, we have two contributors who talked about their individual kind of practices and then how they collaborated on some exhibitions. So we have Kenda Zellner-Smith with Save the Boards Minneapolis and Kassie Bradshaw Kmitch, who is an independent 3D scanner and archaeologist.
Hello, everybody. My name is Kenda. Can you hear me okay? You're good. Okay. Just want to check on that, but I'm so happy to be here. I'm happy that everybody's here. Rebekah is amazing. It's been so amazing to work with her and to get to pick her brain and just learn more about this project and everything else that she's done. A little bit of background on me. I don't come from a background of organizing at the level that I've been doing this past year. I kind of jumped into this, when things happened, and Rebekah was one of the first people that really got beside me and helped guide me. So for that, I'm forever grateful and happy to still be working and learning more from her. What I've been doing is collecting boards and murals that were created after the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. As I've gone on to collect, there's been a lot that I've learned along the way. Kassie is one of those people that I've met and learned more about the digital side of this work and preserving, these physical pieces in a way that we can have long-term. And that was something that right at the beginning I was thinking about, but not thinking about in ways that, I think were a reality. And now that's happening. And so through our partnership, we've been, exploring what scanning boards looks like, curating these spaces online so they are accessible for people outside of the community, so they're free. That's been really important to us. And so Kassie has also been a huge contributor in that for myself and my learning and the decisions in terms of what to do with, you know, the several hundred boards that are currently in Save the Boards storage. And so, yeah, that's a little bit about me and what we're doing. And Kassie, I don't know if you want to take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Kenda. And thank you to all the fellow contributors. I'm really excited to learn more about everybody's projects. Yeah, our work has been such a wild ride. And I'm just working really hard to take literally tangible and intangible, right? We've got these tangible pieces of protest art, 3D scanning them, creating a digital facsimile that's sort of intangible in a way, but still able to be interfaced with in the online space. And then in some cases, the physical boards no longer exist. So then the digital facsimile is now the only record, or other maybe photographs that people have taken are the only extant version of the work that exists. And in some cases, the digital work and the physical work can coexist. And so we're just kind of navigating that ride right now.
Any more you want to say, or are you ready to move on?
Oh, I guess, yeah, sorry. My background is I came from a history and archaeology background, and I consider myself a bioarchaeologist. And so when George Floyd was murdered and the Twin Cities were kind of plunged into this civil unrest, into danger, and it truly, you know, our city is still recovering from that tragedy and the many more that have happened since. But I just completely switched my focus and kind of embraced digital archaeology at that time and tried to look at how the tools that I would use for much older artifacts or much older things like cave art or skeletal remains or things like this could be transitioned to, you know, the now and the present, and preserving art that's being created day to day. Art is being created every day and art is being lost every day.
Thank you, both of you, for that introduction. Next, I'm going to introduce Megan Bredeson. Her project is called Zen and the Act of. So Megan, thank you for joining.
Hi. Thanks for having me. I'm not seeing myself up here yet, so I don't know if you can you guys hear me? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Yeah, so Zen and the Act of is my approach as a complete beginner to ideas about Zen as a practice and sort of exploring what the messages are that connect with people, even though it is, for me, for example, it was a foreign realm that really struck chords within me, and in wanting to become a more active participant in whatever I'm doing. I think that connects to, for example, you know, making a difference the way that Kenda and Kassie are in Minneapolis, and I thank them very much for their work, since I used to live in Minneapolis, and it's just been a really emotionally touching thing to see the work that's being done, and yeah, express solidarity. But per kind of what Sher was talking about the connection between body and mind, I see a lot of parallels, because according to Zen practitioners, body and mind are the same thing. So I'm seeing a connection there. And basically, I've written out my thoughts and I've written out my observations, and my background is in art history as well. So this was sort of a foray into philosophy that was actually a little experimental for me in that way. And yeah, it's still in progress, and I'm adding some updates. So I hope people will check back.
Thank you. Yes. I don't know if you mentioned that you are touching on craft as part of that too. So it's both the philosophy of Zen and how that embodies itself in practice, which
Yes, the
it's really
craft
great.
part is still to come for the most part, but yeah. And while we're touching on that, it's my first foray into that aspect was connected to a book called Zen and the Art of Archery by Eugene Herrigel. And I've recently learned that Herrigel had some unsavory activities and had Nazi sympathies. So actually to kind of level the playing field, I would like to right now shout out Angel Kyoto Williams' work. She's a Black American practitioner of Zen and an activist. And her book is called Being Black, Zen and the Art of Living Fearlessly with Fearlessness and Grace. And she's also a co-author on a work called Radical Dharma, Talking Race, Love, and Liberation. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you for the leveling. That might be a good idea. All right.
Yeah.
I guess with that, I will now transition us a little bit. So we next have, sorry, I think we have Adam Dudley-Mallick next. Here we go. No. Sorry. There we are. All right, Adam.
Okay.
I'll leave it to you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's great to see everybody, all the fellow kind of contributors. Yeah, so my project is called Portable Islam. And I guess it kind of started, I have a background in architecture, and my undergraduate dissertation was looking at British mosques and identity and kind of, yeah, how different communities kind of visually express, you know, identity and all these kind of different factors. But the other thing I was really interested in the kind of research I was doing was kind of symbols. Yeah, kind of minarets and domes and kind of what's essential in a mosque, what's needed, how much of it is cultural. So yeah, Portable Islam is a kind of sort of continuation of that work. It is like an animated short film that, yeah, looks at how Islamic prayer works on sort of different levels. Yeah, looking at sort of mosque as a community, as a gathering space, as a maker of communities, but then also looking at it on a kind of personal level, on an individual level, kind of like the spiritual side of it. And yeah, really kind of the thing I wanted to highlight was the juxtaposition between kind of ritual actions, so like laying out the prayer mat and kind of, you know, the very defined actions that you have to do as part of the prayer, and the kind of potential for transcendence and kind of this really big, I don't know, kind of ethereal kind of aspect of it. And yeah, there's kind of different elements of how different symbols, architectural symbols, are used in prayer mat designs and in mosques to kind of represent those ideas. But yeah, that's a brief kind of intro to my project.
Thank you, Adam. Yeah, it's one of those things you almost need to see the video to fully get, but at the same time, you did a nice job.
Thank you.
Yes. I know it's always so hard when you're like each of these projects also wanting to see it. Better reason to go see the story map, everyone. All right, sorry. Do you want to advance the next slide? So Ashley is unable to join us right now, so I got charged with giving a brief introduction, so I hope I do that justice. But Ashley's work looks at the process of being a pilgrim on the Camino de Santiago in northern Spain. And she did that through both the practice of a pilgrimage and also through kind of the lens of her own work as an architectural conservationist. She does a lot with technology and 3D scanning as well. So her project includes some specifics into techniques she utilized to do a non-invasive form of conservation and kind of reconstruction of different elements. And then also how you digitally archive an experience. You know, how do you translate something that is meant to be a physical thing that you do and put it into a digital realm in a meaningful way? And, you know, is that the same in some capacity? And also highlighting the importance of craft and how, as much as we do with technology, there's still something about the hand of the artist that seems to have a really important play in how we do conservation and preservation work. So yeah, definitely encourage looking at her talk about it, not just me talk about it in our YouTube discussion. All right, next. Saul, I was going to see if Saul was able to join us. They were also, I think, caught up. So I will also introduce Saul's work. Saul is an artist.
No, I'm here, Rebecca.
Oh, Saul, I see you. Thank you. I'll let you take it from me then, please.
Well, okay, so I didn't get to arrive in the Zoom room until a little after, folks. I'm currently in the middle of a weekend immersion thing, which I can speak to more, but I also think that it's quite serendipitous doing this and that at the same time, and I'm not at home. And but my question for you is, since my work isn't really a project, but more of a process, how should I speak to that?
If you want to just summarize in 3 to 5 minutes what you feel that means for you, that would be perfect.
Okay. Well, if you read some grant applications, I'm like an interdisciplinary artist, like working at these such and such intersections. I live in the Twin Cities, and I feel very much that there are through lines of my practice, my identity, and my spirituality, my practice / body, identity, and spirituality in all areas of my life. And so for me, when I'm writing grant applications, that comes down to interdisciplinary artist, right? So to be more literal about that, though, I'm really interested in the way that I identify, and other people who identify like me, that being, you know, trans or queer, in terms of identity, and for me that really means anything outside of the binary. I'm looking at, in a lot of areas in my life, I'm looking at the way that my body specifically takes up space and moves through space. I'm looking at spiritual practices that I grew up with that informed my own sense of identity at an early age, and how it might be different, and my own understanding of self different now, and how spirituality or organized religion or its practices have literally or figuratively affected my body or the landscape of my internal understanding. I'm wondering, did I say anything else? Basically, what I like to do is reflect on a lot of my day-to-day life, resulting in a poetic synthesis or understanding of what I'm going through, that is including bodily references, and also my own spiritual understanding or references or touchstones for spirituality in the Midwest. And that ends up looking like a sculpture, maybe, or a dance sometimes, or maybe even a zine with hand illustrated knot work throughout. Yeah. Rebecca, should I speak to anything more?
I think that's perfect for now, because we'll finish introductions and then have opportunity to kind of explore some things as a group. So
Great.
I think that gives a nice introduction. Thank you. So our final contributor is Matthew Wright. So Matt, I thought I saw you on as well.
Yeah, I'm here.
All right. Hello, Matthew. You want to speak about sacred nationalism?
Sure. Hi, everybody. It's very nice to be here. Thanks to Rebekah for organizing this. She's been working extremely hard, and I've been very, I felt extremely sorry for her over the past few days. So anyway, my project is basically about the idea. I took some ideas from, if you're familiar with Mircea Eliade, who's a scholar of religion, was based at the University of Chicago for a lot of years. He was originally from Romania, was sort of a scholar of world religion and particularly sort of Hinduism and other things like that. But he wrote a book. He's sort of somewhat responsible, one of the people responsible for creating this sort of binary between sacred and profane. It wasn't just him. People like Emil Durkheim and others have been talking about it too. But he was one of the influential people in talking about that. So I wanted to take this idea of sacrality, of something being sacred, of being a sacred space, and try to apply that to spaces in the United States, in the Western United States, mostly in North and South Dakota, in Montana, and a little bit in Idaho and Wyoming, which I sort of by happenstance went on a trip to this summer, so I took a lot of photos. But really is looking at monuments, really, monuments, national monuments, monuments to battles, monuments to people. It could be old, actually, there's also an old church, an old mission church in Idaho was included as well, some old forts. So I was really thinking about this idea of like, how do you make a space sacred? I mean, Eliade talks about this idea of moving into a space. When people move from one place to another, they have ways of making that space sacred. I mean, a way to make the space sacred, to be habitable, to be able to live there, effectively, you have to make the space sacred in some way, right? And so you can see that process happening all over the world, right? The idea of like when communities of people move from one place to another, this could be the case of, say, building a mosque, could be the case of building a church. But I was looking at it in terms of, in locations where people are migrating to. In this case, I was looking at sort of how you think about sacred space in terms of how Americans have done this, right? How Americans have done this over the past 200, 300, 400 years in this country. And one of those ways, I think, has been by building monuments, right? Monuments are something that mark a space as being ours, in a way, as being sacred to us, right? But what's interesting about it is because it's frequently quite layered, right? Some of these places have layers of sacrality, right? There may be a pre-existing notion of sacrality. For example, Mount Rushmore is a good example, right? Mount Rushmore was that area for many sort of hundreds of years until the late part of the 18th century was occupied by the Cheyenne Indians. Then they were conquered by the Lakota in the late part of the 18th century. And then they in turn were effectively conquered by the United States in the late part of the 19th century. And so you have multiple layers of sacrality, multiple layers of occupation in space. And Eliade's idea basically is that in order to exist, as an idea I mentioned before, to exist in a space, you have to make it sacred. That sort of hierophany, you have to manifest the sacred in a way to make a space habitable for you and for your people, right? And so, yeah, just taking that lens, that idea of sacrality, the idea of creating sacred space. And I was looking at this in terms of things that are in my own country, in the United States, particularly in the northwestern sort of portion of the country. So that's a quick summary. I looked at a few different sites and I tried to think about these complex issues in terms of those different places. So. If that
Thank
works
you, Matt.
really fast, but it's good.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I know, that's why I'm like, each of these, there should be, an hour-long talk for, which is why we made YouTube talks.
We have one, right?
Right. You can find it on YouTube. No, thank you to each of you. I think I mentioned I'm the final one. Mine is called Sacred Shift, and that's what led us into this tangible and tangible theme. So yes, thank you to each of you. Kind of for the rest of our time, I wanted to leave this a little more conversational, a little less me feeling like I'm putting you on the spot with things. But as I noted, with each of these projects, there's been a number of kind of interloping or overlapping themes. And I think the first one is one everyone touched on at least a little bit, of there being a binary or not within their project of, is there something tangible? Is there something intangible? How are those things overlapping or being disrupted, or finding, if that's an exhibition in physical form versus a 3D scan, if that's the experience of prayer in a mosque or in a video, if that's, even Megan with her, there's a center and it's a core, not a this and that binary. So does anyone feel like they would want to speak to that?
The core is everything, according
The core is everything. It encompasses the binary. Right.
It doesn't even encompass it because there's no limit, I suppose.
Oh no.
Not to be too pedantic. Here we go. Yeah.
It's already happening. Yes. Anyone want to speak to that within their theme or in something they heard in someone else's?
Well, I'll just briefly say that, yeah, the whole point of the Zen and craft discussion that I'm looking at is that there's no, it's all this of a piece is the basic idea, that there is no tangible versus intangible. The tangible is intangible and vice versa. It all comes together. So in action, whether it be through activism, through art, through, sitting, your internal world is supposed to become one with the external. There's no difference. That's the idea.
Well, I guess I would say, I know with Adam, that's something we explored in your video quite a bit too, was like that marriage between internal world, external world, how do you draw that, right? Like, how are you drawing something that's internal and making it external? And animation was maybe a way to explore that. I don't know if you want to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, that's kind of why I mentioned my dissertation at the start, because that was a very kind of academic, it's like a long piece of writing. But there were kind of these themes that I was like, I don't know how, like, this is a really interesting concept and there are these kind of overlaps, but that wasn't the right piece to do that. So then, yeah, I kind of had these visual images. So Matthew mentioned Iliade, who was one of the core texts for this kind of research, and this, one of the ideas he has is of like an axis mundi, which kind of connects our world, the kind of normal everyday world, to the kind of heavens above and the underworld below, and it's kind of where you get these transcendent experiences. And it's kind of, I don't know, you kind of, I at least had a very clear image of what that looked like internally, but that is just a representation, and that's how I've interpreted it. And I felt that an animation was the best way to show that. But it's kind of, I don't know, I think there's different variations of it. So that could just be a thing that happens every time you like walk into a mosque or walk into a church, kind of thing.
Well, and I will say that's something that came up again. Well, both you and Matt brought up Eliada, and so, but it did come up in both of your talks, where it was that, what is sacred? How do you remove sacredness? Is that something that you put on? Is it something you take off? Is it just I'll do my best, Megan, to explain this right. Is it something that's just constant?
Put on my mic just so I could laugh at you. But
thank you. Yes, that's constant. Not an enter and leave situation, right?
Well,
it is a center.
Yeah, it's a very meta conversation, and again,
right.
I'm not an expert, but these would be technically considered, I think, labels that we're putting on things that
we shouldn't be labeling. Fair
well,
enough.
I don't. Well, I don't know. There's no should either. So it's the thought, I guess. It's a thought. But
yeah, I guess I was gonna say within that, I think something that Matt and I did in our talk that was helpful was defining what we meant as sacred. And so like the word gets thrown out all the time, but what does that actually mean? And I think the definition we came up with was just being set apart. So it's like you have your everyday experience and then you have the things that are not that. And is there some kind of recognition of that? And I actually saw Kassie included in the chat, and I'm glad she did because I wanted to bring this up. How you can point to things that maybe people aren't considering sacred and lift them up as that. And I think the process of making monuments like Matt was exploring is probably a more obvious example, although he was looking at it in the context of national identity, not necessarily churches, but war monuments. Versus then we have, boards that are meant to just be protective, that then become artistic expression, that then become physical and digital expressions of that within new contexts. So maybe, I don't know, I said a lot at one time, but maybe Matt or Kenda and Kassie, if you guys want to talk about this idea of sacredness, and actually share with your notion of soup as sacred, could just keep triangulating, but yeah. Sorry, I heard you, Matt. Do you want to start?
I can go a little bit. Yeah, I think this is really, it's easy, I think, in a way, and I think Eliade has taken a lot of criticism for this in a way of sort of reifying a kind of a binary that is not terribly accurate. And I understand that critique, and I think it has some validity. But I think, like Rebekah mentioned, as we were sort of struggling towards an idea of what being sacred is, I think it was from Hebrew, I think you were talking about what the sacred is set apart, coming out of the Jewish tradition. It's something it's something that we experience, right? In a way, it's sort of imbricated, right? This overlapping tiles of sacrality and profanity, I guess. They're not separable, right? But conceptually, and in terms of space, I think especially is important to really think about. We have a different experience in different spaces, right? As we move through the world, I think the Saul mentioned, so the notion of one's body moving through the world, right? That process is something that we have different experiences in different places. And it feels different to us, right? And some places are, in a way, set aside. Sacred spaces, obviously sacred spaces, meaning like religious spaces, have a notion of being set apart. But you see it in lots of different ways too, I think. And you can talk about it in terms of space being set apart. It could be even like, say, national parks. I was talking to a friend, I think this came up in the talk too. National parks are set apart, right? They're marked as being a separate space. Even a city park is marked as being a separate space. It's different, right, from what surrounds it. So I think that was interesting. It's useful in a way to, recognizing it's complicated and it's overlapping and it's sort of mutually sort of interpenetrated. I think that was actually redundant. Anyway, but it's still it's worth thinking about. Yeah, and objects, and the question about the boards that Kenda's involved in, Rebekah's been involved in too, and how does an object go from just a simply utilitarian thing, right, to being something artistic, and then having some sort of layer of sacrality, as being special in some way, right? So it's quite fascinating, actually, to see this process happening in a way in real time. Something really going from completely everyday and profane to something special. And I think that's an interesting process to witness and to reflect upon historically and in the present.
Yeah, and just so,
I was gonna say.
Okay. So yeah, just going off of that, very quickly on in the project, there was a Zoom call that I was on, and I can't remember the name of the person that said this sentence, but it's what stuck with me and I think really kind of pushed my drive to start collecting. And it was, how do we value the life and the death of these boards? And I think when we talk about tangible and intangible, it's how do we give space to the life and death of the tangible and intangible piece of these boards? And as I've gone on to collect, and there's been conversations, I've also had to reflect on how did actually collecting them impact the original sacredness that they held, the places that they were left, that they were created in with no real thought, long-term thought, short-term thought. It was just in that moment. And so I think it's a very layered and complex conversation that I'm still learning about every single day with different pieces, with different artists that feel differently about their boards being saved. There have been people that have, they don't want any input on what happens to their boards because they didn't create them to be the face of them or for them to be something that was held on to. And so it's really interesting, meeting the different people and figuring out what feels like the best path to take with them in terms of trying to give them that space and value them while also respecting that the initial collection of them kind of already impacted that in a way that you can't go back on now. They're sitting in a storage unit right now. They're not on the street where people can see them. And so while we're actively trying to figure out ways to do that, you know, you then have to look at the present moment right now and what does that look like and how is that kind of backtracking on the work we're doing. So that's something that's just always a thought that I feel like is very interesting and an important point to make in these conversations. Kassie, I don't know if you have any input on just any of that, but I think it's really important, and it's really our big goal is to find that digital space so we can still at least continue the conversations, because every event that we're taking these boards out at, every time we're organizing them, they're chipping away. You know, the paint is starting to fall off. Some of them have paper on them. Some of the really interesting ones are not just created out of paint and spray paint. There's a lot more to them, and they aren't going to be here forever. And so what does that look like? And I think a big piece of it is they're a symbol of a very temporary fix to a problem that's continuing. You know, as Kassie mentioned earlier, there's more boards being created. There are newer boards this summer. And so how do we also separate boards from 2020 and boards from 2021, but also bring them together in a way that highlights the cycle of, you know, murder that's still continuing, and just that, you know, the difference in the time periods of that and the boards that were created and the energy that went into each of them.
And Kenda and I, and everyone that's in the Twin Cities metro, there are many contributors here who make that space their home. We're living in real time as communities are creating sacredness in places that were not previously considered sacred. And so it's an organic process. It's at least my lived experience of living through this. It's not one day something isn't sacred and one day it is, but we're new monument. I don't know if monument probably is not the appropriate term, but there are memorial spaces in our city that have been created out of the extrajudicial killings and murders that have been happening. And those spaces in particular, I guess if we focus on George Floyd, like 30th in Chicago of now is not the 30th in Chicago of 2 years ago. And it's a constantly changing space. And the art that's created from that space changes. Some of the protest works from different parts of the city have a different level of sacredness to them than other parts of the city. And it's all very organic, constantly changing, constantly navigating, and a daily, I think like a daily, not necessarily struggle, but just daily mindfulness and doing emergency preservation work is doing no harm and constantly evaluating where we are in the space, what the space means, how can we serve the community with intentionality in the best way for the most people in the current moment. And the answers to those questions differ day to day, week to week, year to year.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not a small question to be like, how do you make things sacred? I do want to give chance for both Saul and Sher maybe to speak to this as well, because I'm thinking, Saul, you talked through the process of how you were thinking through even to define what practice is, because it's an embodiment of the always, I think is how it kind of came through in our discussion. And that's hard, right? Because if everything's sacred, nothing's sacred. And how are you drawing a boundary around those things if you are? So maybe you can speak to that a little.
Yeah, it's actually something that I kind of wanted to say, like that there's this through line that I feel like I'm observing right now, where all of us as creators have in one sense or another encountered a binary or a juxtaposition or a discord, some sort of disharmony that we recognized in ourselves. Like we thought, hey, no. And so we found this third space, this other space, which could be a dissertation, which could be a digital platform, which could be a storage unit filled with artwork. to justify our own unification of those things. And I think that it's really, really interesting, because what are we trying to get at? Like this unification, this like Meg was saying, like about like the practice of Zen, like, I mean, so much of the other is already in the thing anyway, and it's already whole, no matter how many divisions you create in it. Like if you zoom out, it's already unity. And so to answer your question without answering your question at all, Rebekah, is I don't know. And I think that's what we're all like wrestling with. And the process of wrestling with it and displaying it allows us to come together in this shared feeling, right? I mean, I'd love somebody else to jump off of that.
Maybe, can I think the thought that's coming, listening to everybody's responses, is I think being intentional, including action in a way, is sacred, and being in community with others. And in a Zen or a general Buddhist kind of way, one would, speak about reducing suffering and being compassionate toward everyone. And so I find that to be a unifying thing. I don't know what others think.
I wanted to draw on what Kassie said. The challenge I faced in my project is, how do you study a community that is emplacing the sacred onto the profane? So in particular, what I'm referencing to is that the Nation of Islam first gathered on the top floor of the Castle Theater, which was one of the many, many theaters dotting the streets of Hastings Street, which doesn't exist anymore, but back then it was a prominent space of entertainment for African-American migrants who lived there and for the performers who came in and performed. So it's a really interesting image to try to paint. It probably requires a film producer and rather than a historian to really do justice to what that means for the history of 20th century Islam in America, to be born on the top floor of a theater, right? So that's the kind of question that it really intrigued me is, when you look at mosques, and this is where I 100% agree with the definition that you guys came up with, that the sacred is setting apart. And then the question then becomes, when you set apart, how does that thing that you set apart from is influencing you nonetheless? And as a historian, what frustrated me with the traditional method of studying religion and Islam in particular is that they would look at sacrality from a very kind of esoteric, non-tangible way. So in this context, the sacred idea here is that we are reverting to Islam rather than converting to Islam, because Islam was taken away from us and it lapsed as a result of enslavement. Now that's an idea that one could, and many people do, study intellectually by looking at writings of Elijah Muhammad, for instance. Well, look at what he wrote. If he wrote a book about eating, for instance, well, let's see how this writing of Elijah compares to something that a Muslim may have written in 15th century Syria. I'm just kind of being hypothetical there for the exaggerated effect. I found that very frustrating because I wanted to emplace Islam in America, by which I mean, I wanted to make the point that to understand what's happening with this burgeoning Muslim community, you have to understand what's happening in the United States, but also across the globe. What are some big macro shifts taking place that are shaping people's ideas about food, for instance, here, right? So, and so that is a challenge, because to understand the uniqueness of the Nation of Islam, to draw the contrast, in other words, between Clara Muhammad and her sisters dressing fully from the top to the ankles and having this regiment of, measuring their weight and having these classes and teaching kids in this like a homeschool movement that they start, to draw the contrast between her and all the other women who are attending the vaudeville theater and going to the jazz, etc., I had to also sort of like look at the overlapping features between like a woman like Clara and the other women who are facing this predicament of poverty in Detroit, but also women like Clara and other women who are white, like Kellogg's wife, Ella Eaton, who is also as much invested in the chemistry of cooking as Clara is. And that becomes a really challenging part, but that's the only reason I'm interested in writing, because otherwise, if I were to just look at like a very kind of intangible way of thinking about sexuality, which like a kind of like an esoteric way, I would absolutely hate my craft. And I'm very much with, I'm trying to memorize everyone's names. Adam, when Adam said, you know, at the beginning, I was like kind of done with like the typical research. I totally feel that, because I feel like when you look at other things like architecture or 3D designing, or even photography, you know, the question really, I think what we're all trying to like wrestle with is how do you spatialize history? Because it's very easy to just look at history of ideas without like paying attention to streets. And for me, I'm trying to do that through writing, fortunately or unfortunately, basically because that's my craft. But I do like the fact that we have such different methods, all trying to wrestle with that problem of spatializing the sacred and its profane effects, I suppose.
I suppose I have a little anecdote that fits this conversation, but I remember reading and hearing one thing that I don't know if they were Chan practitioners from China or Zen in Japan or both, but there's this game or tradition of when a student would ask a teacher, what is Zen? They would respond with the most profane thing you could think of possible. So the classic response was a dung scraper, which is basically like precursor to toilet paper. And so it's something, it's about creating a verbal space in a way for, it's something not describable then, I suppose. That's another aspect.
I have to say, having 8 total strangers come onto a call with each other could be a really interesting experience, and I'm very grateful that it made sense. So you guys are doing a fantastic job. That was one of many questions I had ready for today, and we probably won't have space for most of them. I did want to encourage, I realized we only have a few minutes left of our 1 hour we kind of gave ourselves. So if anybody that's listening that is not a speaker had any questions, please do feel free to ask something in the chat, and I'll try to pay attention to that as best I can. But otherwise, I will wrap this up with maybe one more thought and then see where we're at. But I was thinking within all of this, another theme that came up for me that I thought was interesting is the theme of like memory and archive and representation, because a lot of the themes that were being represented also all seemed like things that there isn't really, you know, the archive of fill in the blank this thing, or, you know, how are we activating the process of having a memory around this thing and talking about those memories. You know, for a lot of these things, it's projects that are inventing a methodology while they're inventing a topic or researching and exploring a topic. And I thought that was a really interesting kind of through thread of not really having something you were directly able to look to, even if you have some, you know, kind of grounding for where you started. So I wondered if anyone was willing to talk about just the process of what it feels like to go through putting together something you're so passionate about while still figuring out how you're supposed to do it.
I can really quickly say something. I actually did not know really what Rebekah and I were going to talk about before we started talking, to be perfectly frank. We've had like a lot of conversations around these themes over the past couple of years. And so I hadn't really decided actually that like it was going to be about these sort of monuments in the Western US and talk about nationalism and sacrality and that sort of stuff, but it just ended up being that way. So that's kind of the funny think about that method. And I probably, if I'd planned it more ahead of time, I probably would have been way more anxious about it. But sort of like letting it happen in a kind of organic way. I know it's going to be kind of about this stuff, and we'll see where the conversation goes, and we'll kind of like build the story map after. It actually worked out pretty well, honestly. So, and some of you I know, like doing this stuff, like you have specific research projects you've been working on for years, and this is just sort of one manifestation of a larger sort of project. But it was definitely not like that for me. So, no, it's all for me.
Yeah, I wanted to say on that this kind of concept for an animation that looks at the kind of themes I did end up looking at, kind of prayer and architecture and art and transcendence, were kind of in my head, but I thought the route to it would be so kind of long, and I was like, maybe I should learn how to animate first, and then do some small little pieces as tests, and then I'll like eventually work up to it. But then when I saw that Rebekah had this kind of project, and the themes just serendipitously like aligned with what this idea was, I was kind of like, okay, maybe this is like a sign kind of thing, like let's just do it. And it's really interesting because having that deadline of that kind of fixed end goal kind of just, I don't know, it's a great motivator. I mean, I've not made an animation before, so it's very sort of, I think I remember saying to Rebekah at the start, like, just to like be upfront, like I have no idea how this is going to turn out, but we're going to see what happens. But yeah, I don't know, it's just yeah, I mean, it's been a lovely experience. So
just to comment, I have seen Adam sketch before, so I knew we were in for something good. It wasn't totally blind faith, but and with Adam, yeah. Sorry, anyone else want to answer?
Well, I guess my experience was similar to others in that this was a totally personal interest of mine before we got in touch about it. So I'm also in the realm of people who are used to doing historical research, and there are aspects that it's nice to escape or circumvent or whatever. But so it was actually it's a spiritual journey in a way. I'm finding out more about myself, and I get all the existential angst along the way to enjoy. And it's been a good experience in that way.
Sorry, I'm just looking through to make sure I'm not missing any questions. Thank you, Saul, for putting the link to viewing some things in the chat. Just to give space, anyone else want to answer the question of how do you create your own archive, how you're creating your own form of memory in the process of creating, creating whatever it is you're working through?
I could add a bit. For me, with this particular project, what has helped me a lot is to think through how digitized photographs can be written about by a historian. Because usually with the historians, we tend to look for archives. We go to libraries, go to the microfilms. But one of the good problems, thankfully, or for Islam, is there are not that many archives. It's not like you can go to the Catholic University and just, for Catholic University, you go there, you find like, all sorts of things, meeting books, all that kind of good stuff, letters, correspondence. So you just don't have that kind of resource for Islam in America. So it's a big challenge, but it's something I was really, that's been good to me, because what I found when I was working through this project is an architect, Emily Kutel, from Detroit area, who took all the photographs of the Hastings Street neighborhood that had been stored in the Detroit Public Library and created a digital exhibit out of those pictures. And those pictures were really useful for me just to get a sense of what's happening in 1930 Detroit, because I'm talking about this figure, Clara. I need to really try to make sense of like, where is she walking? What does the area look like? Are there grocery stores in the area, for instance, you know? And so to think about, okay, what do pictures reveal? What do these pictures conceal? Because again, these pictures were photographed by the city when they were raising the neighborhood. So these are not neutral pictures. Again, no picture, I suppose, is neutral, right? So there is a certain reason these pictures were taken. There were certain authorities who were taking these pictures. So they're going to reveal something and conceal other things. So I suppose to churn more writing out of analyzing these images is something that's been really useful for me.
So I'm noticing we are out of time. So thank you, Sher, for that thorough and very historian-based answer. What can I glean from photos? No, in general though, I am very, very grateful for all of the contributions, but also the three threads in the conversation. Like I was saying, I knew it was a gamble, saying, I think all of you will talk together and it will be great. And it is nice that it worked. I think more or less anyway. But yes, I do want to encourage anyone that was attending that has no idea what we're talking about, please do check out the story map. We also have a YouTube playlist that's just conversations between me and the different contributors that kind of goes over each of their topics more in depth. And I want to thank everyone again for their time. Thank you to Sher and Amanda for inviting me to do this.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks. It's been great. I also wanted to tell the contributors too in the future. So we're currently working on some big grants right now. The future of the Religion, Art, and Technology Lab. We're going to be doing tracing the lives of plants and peoples, and the intangible, or the immaterial, material connections between the plant world and our world. And we're putting Rebekah on that project as well. Giving her a huge task because it's going to involve images, it's going to involve sounds, it's going to involve a podcast, all that good stuff. So if you're interested in contributing to that project, definitely stay in touch as well. All right, thanks for joining us. I'm going to end the record.